The Carolina Nature Coalition is a community organization based here in New Bern, North Carolina, whose mission is to raise awareness of environmental issues and environmental social justice issues by engaging citizens in meaningful community action. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Susannah Tuttle. I think she's going to be our speaker. Susannah is the director of the North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light, which is part of the North Carolina Council of Churches, and she's a very busy person. When I first tried to contact her, she was on her way to Washington, D.C. And she's been traveling. So for this here, she will bring us the latest news on the UN climate conference, the COP26, which just concluded in Glasgow, Scotland. And she knows that very well about that because she served as the anchor, the US-based anchor for her organization, for the Interfaith Power and Light, those that went over to the conference. So Susannah will also provide us with guidance on what we can be doing to protect our planet and its people. So, Susannah, take it away.
Well, thank you. It is so great to be with all of you tonight, and I do appreciate this virtual option as I am here on the land of the Occaneechi and Shakori and Eno peoples, known as Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I'm actually a little bit west of Chapel Hill, out in the country. So I appreciate rural communities, and I do love New Bern, and I hope to visit again very, very soon. It's one of my favorite places in the state with all of your rich biodiversity, amazing history, people, and the people of faith and conscience that I get to work with through your entire Eastern region is just really a blessing. So thank you. You're an inspiration to me every day. And I'm going to go through quite a lot in a very short amount of time. And I hope that this is just the beginning of many, many conversations that we can be having as often as you would like. I have had a huge awakening over the course of really the past, well, my whole life. Every day you wake up as a new awakening, right? But many of you know that I have been at the North Carolina Council of Churches directing the North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light campaign as part of the National Interfaith Power and Light movement for over 10 years. I celebrated my 10th anniversary in August of this year. I started in 2011. So I don't know where the time has gone, but I will say that my work in educating, inspiring, and mobilizing people of faith and conscience to act on climate as a moral imperative has really changed throughout those 10 years. And I know all of you in this room are called to be a part of the Carolina Nature Coalition because you are already engaged and impassioned and empowered to take action. And so we've all seen, you know, for those of us that were maybe early to the conversation, recognizing that there was not just a climate change taking place, but it truly is a climate emergency and a climate crisis, and actually the greatest crisis of our existence and all planetary species on this beautiful Mother Earth that we share as home. So yeah, I'm spending a lot less time trying to explain what climate change is and now trying to address the issues and impacts, as we said, as a moral imperative. So tonight, thank you. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to speak about COP26 in such real time. We just have come, we're just weeks out. And actually today I'm going to have a real-time update from you from the United States State Department, because between 4 and 5 o'clock this afternoon, I participated along with approximately 160 members of civil society in getting the report back from the U.S. State Department delegation that represented our entire country and spoke to the whole world about where the United States is in relationship to our climate commitments. So I'm going to get to that in a little bit. But first, and I can't see all of you, so maybe I can just hear your voices, or for those of you on Zoom, if you want to put into the chat. I want to start with has everyone heard about COP26? And is there anyone in the room that has no idea what we're talking about right now? Just to give a little bit of a grounding for myself. So it sounds like I don't see anything in the chat, and it sounds like the people in the room are there. Yes, I see from Penny Hooper in the chat. She has heard of COP26. Wonderful. Well, great. Then I'm going to go into the screen share portion of this presentation, and we can just kind of walk through this. And please do yell out or scream out anything that you have as we're going along in questions, because I want this to be interactive. And as I mentioned, this is a lot of information, but I want to give you the grounding so that as we do this work together moving forward, we're kind of all on the same page. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully this will work. And you should be able to see a slide deck. And now I'm going to share that. Whoops, not like that. I'm going to go into present mode. Okay, and you should be able to, oh, that did not work. All right, so let's try that one more time. So what is COP26? Great question. Okay, so for better or for worse, this year, and we missed a year because of the pandemic. So last year was supposed to be COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland. And I often, people ask me, how do they, pick where they're going to be, and all of these different kinds of questions that come up. I often refer to this as sort of the political version of the Olympics. Cities actually apply to become a host for the Conference of Parties, which is the acronym COP. That's how we get that acronym, the Conference of Parties. And a party is a country, essentially. So it could be Conference of Countries. But these started now 27 years ago. And this was the 26th meeting of all of the Conference of Parties that intentionally came together to have a conversation about the climate crisis and what we were going to commit to do as a world. And we have some just basic facts here that you can see. 154 nations signed on to the UN Convention on Climate. That was in 1992. And then it was in 2015, where 196, so that's an additional number of countries that came into the Conference of Parties, signed the Paris Climate Agreement. It's pretty amazing to imagine that the Paris Climate Agreement was, over 6 years ago. It happened at the COP in Paris. So if you ever have a question about why it's called that, it's because that's where the Conference of Parties were meeting, in Paris. And so the 4 top goals for the gathering in Glasgow were: 1, work together to deliver on the Paris Agreement. I don't have to tell all of you in this room and on this Zoom that our previous president's administration and the president at the time attempted to pull us out of the Paris Agreement. So we lost a good 4 years in developing a climate change strategy to deliver on the Paris Agreement. And again, don't have to, hit this too hard on the head, but that held back the entire world. When the United States does not do something, it impacts the globe. When we do something, it also impacts the globe. So it's so important that we were there, and that this administration now was one of the leading voices in prioritizing that we would deliver on the Paris Agreement. So a second priority was to secure global net zero by 2050 and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. I'm going to come back to this point because I would love to give another presentation at another time around how the language of net zero is incredibly dangerous and is a kind of greenwashing that corporations and utility companies are using to highlight and prioritize market-based mechanisms for carbon trading programs, which actually does not cut pollution at its source. So it doesn't actually address the climate emergency. It just moves it around in a market-based economy that benefits the polluters and does nothing to help those that are most at risk, which at this point is every single living being on the planet. So the fact that this was one of the goals set by the United Nations and the IFCCC, there's a lot of acronyms, but what essentially makes up how the COP works, this was one of their goals. And so there was a lot that went on behind the scenes, and especially from NGOs, nonprofits, and developing nations, and the global South in particular, that really lifted up the issues and the dangerousness of using the language of net zero. But again, for another time, that's a whole entire presentation to itself. The goal of keeping 1.5 degrees within reach was absolutely the #1 priority. And the issue with this is we are increasingly letting that goal go as we fail to hold our commitments to what we signed at the Paris Climate Agreement. And what's important about understanding about the Paris Agreement is that that was the number that those 196 nations committed to limiting global warming to, because we know even by raising the temperatures on a global scale to 1.5 degrees Celsius, that we are going to experience catastrophic effects. So we could not go over that. And then adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. You already know what that means in New Bern and along the coastal communities of how important it is to be able to adapt to the new realities that we experience due to climate change already happening. And then mobilize at least $100 billion in international finance. So those were the top 4 goals for gathering in Glasgow for the COP26 that were established by the United States and other conference of parties around the world. So what I'm going to give you tonight is what the US Climate Action Network's top 3 priorities at COP26 are and continue to be. These are the 3 terms that I want us to begin to better do a deep dive into so that we can be ongoing in our advocacy for what the US Climate Action Network, of which my organization is an active member, and there are over 100, at this point, there's over 190 organizations. So all of the big green organizations that you're familiar with, all the way down to local community-based organizations. In fact, your organization could become a member of the US Climate Action Network. And I will talk with Michael about that, because actually, as I'm thinking about that, that would be really, really cool. We love to have the voices of the community be prioritized. And that's how we were able to develop these top 3 priorities to bring to COP26. US Climate Action Network, or USCAN, that's what that means as the acronym, is the United States arm of the CAN International, of the Climate Action Network International. So USCAN was created over 30 years ago in order for there to be a place where NGOs, non-governmental organizations, members of civil society, of which all of us are, to be able to participate in the global conversation. So that's where USCAN comes together. So loss and damage, finance, and ambition. Those are the 3 priorities for all of the organizations that were attending on behalf of communities in Glasgow. I'm going to come back to loss and damage with the hopes that we will have time for me to show a very short video. So I'm going to start with finance and ambition. So I mentioned that over the course of the last couple of years, I have really been transformed in my ways of working on the climate crisis above and beyond what I was already doing with North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light and helping congregations and communities of faith and conscience learn how to use renewable energy, become more energy efficient, understand what regenerative agriculture was, all the ways that we can act on climate at home. And that's ultimately what is most important, is to remember that all climate action is local. And it is those concentric circles that come together that create the global call to act and create our abilities to actually limit global warming at any level whatsoever. But if we don't do it locally, obviously it can't happen internationally. And so, so it's been really interesting as someone myself who's been working on the climate crisis for as long as I have, to have this kind of great awakening, as I mentioned, that actually took place in 2019. So the U.S. Climate Action Network meets annually. There are two voting participants from each organization that is invited to come to a location in different parts of the country. Penny Hooper, who I believe is on the call, has served as NCIPL's second voting participant along with myself for many, many years now, probably over 8 years. And when we were in St. Paul, Minnesota, there was a presentation that was given called Equitable Global Climate Finance. And I realized that I had never really been given a presentation about what it's actually going to cost to address the climate crisis. And it was put under the large umbrella of fair shares, which is a wonderful term, because I think in our hearts and in our guts, we all know what it means to be responsible for our own fair share. So I'm going to go through, again, this presentation fairly quickly. There's a lot of methodology and details behind it that I look forward to diving deep with you at another time. But I want to give the big picture, because this is what our representation from the U.S. Climate Action Network brought to Glasgow and was introducing to other countries all around the world, and particularly countries that are hit first and worst, and island nations and countries in the global south that are already experiencing what it means to live into climate migration and land loss and loss and damage, and what we will talk about in a moment. They are so grateful that a team of people have put together what the U.S. climate fair share is. Because if the United States does not do our fair share, there is no way that any other country in the world will even think to do theirs or be held accountable to do so. So you can see US CAN's website is on the side of this slide. This is, we launched this website just a little under a year ago in December of 2020. And Bill McKibben immediately wrote an article in the New Yorker magazine about this work that I will share with you, those links that you can go ahead and take a look. So the first thing we need to talk about is the why. The United States overall has the most historic responsibility of any country in the world. And we remain, as far as a carbon emitter, and we remain the world's second highest emitter, only to China, which we know as the current highest emitter, but has 4 times the population. So per capita, we've heard this before, we've probably all done our global footprint, but the United States, with the population that we have, has emitted more carbon emissions into the atmosphere historically than any other country in the world. And a young person that I work with was telling this story. I listened to them explain to their colleagues and friends and family that very first Model T Ford that was, hit the road, and it was such a big celebration. those emissions are still in the atmosphere. So it just, tenfold from the Industrial Revolution to where we are now, we have historic responsibility. Second, and this gets into the finance and ambition piece of our primary goals for the COP26 from the United States. The financial capacity. We are the world's wealthiest country with much of that wealth concentrated in a very small elite. And I don't know about you, but for me, when I have been learning more about this and the opportunities, because I'm a hope-filled person, the idea that we could maybe stop demonizing the very, very rich people that have accumulated an enormous amount of wealth in this country, and instead begin to be able to inspire them to use their money for good, and to say, you've gotten rich. Like, instead of Bezos and everybody going off, to try to get to Mars, use your financial resources to address this problem that you have benefited from. All of the accumulated wealth in this country has come on the backs of individuals and the back of the earth. And we know that. And so the idea that we could inspire and mobilize those financial resources is very exciting to me. So we have the money and we need to spend it well. And then finally, it's the right thing to do. We have a moral and legal obligation to protect human rights, which are threatened by the climate emergency. We know that. And this is, I know so many of you in the room and on Zoom are very, very dedicated to preserving and protecting the United States democracy and the values of democracy. And if we're going to truly shine as a democratic society and listen to the people, by the people, for the people, we know that it is the right thing to do to address the climate emergency and do our fair share. So this is the statement that the U.S. Climate Action Network that I was a part of committed to. This is a very large commitment. This was all over COP26 in Glasgow. Lots of people saw this statement. It's a very overwhelming statement, but I will read it and then explain it. U.S. Climate Action Network believes that the U.S. fair share of the global mitigation effort in 2030 is equivalent to a reduction of 195% below its 2005 emission levels. And then there's a fair share range of 173 to 229 that has a whole methodology behind it that's very, very complicated. But I think I know what your first question is, because it was my first question. How in the world can something be more than 100%? And the reality is that we have put so much carbon emissions into the atmosphere that we have to commit moving forward to reducing 70% of our emissions that we produce domestically. So that's thinking about every power plant, every transportation system, everything that generates carbon emissions in the United States. We've got to get those levels to 70% below where we were at emitting levels at 2005 by 2030. So we've got a little less than, about 8 years to get there. With a view of fully decarbonizing the United States economy as early as possible. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then on the international scale, we have to help developing countries reduce their greenhouse gas emissions beyond what they can do on their own. We are responsible for the emissions that are in the atmosphere, and we need to provide the financial and technological support for countries to reduce their emissions. And many of these countries are burning coal and using deforestation and burning trees to generate electricity and provide heat because they deserve it as much as we do. And so but the levels of emissions in relationship to fair shares is so nominal. And especially in developing nations and poor nations and nations that are literally going to be underwater, they need our help. So that is the combined 195% of what is our global fair share. And as I mentioned on the website, usfairshare.org, there is about 30 years of methodology and research that has gotten us to these numbers. So here's just a really quick graph. Again, happy to do a deeper dive later, but you can see that red zone area, code red, what we're in, is what is projected of where we're moving towards. Our current target in the United States, sadly, does not get us out of the red. It keeps us right in the middle of the red. We've got to get to the domestic reductions of at least 70%, and then that will get us at least into the blue, which will then get us to our fair share target of 195%. This is the cold, hard truth and our reality of what it will take to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we are doing our best to educate everyone we possibly can about how much we actually need to commit to, how we need to identify the financial resources, and then just do it, because we can. We have historic responsibility, we've got the financial capacity, and it's the right thing to do. So wrapping up the fair shares portion of this presentation, as I mentioned, this is what we brought to, when I say we, when I talk about civil society, I realized when I was talking about COP and the United Nations a little bit earlier, and you might already all know this, but there are basically 3 pillars that make up the United Nations, and that is the governmental sector, the business or private sector, corporate sector, and civil society. You, myself, and every single person you know is a member of civil society. So even all of those humans that are part of governments and a part of corporations and private sectors are also members of civil society. So we actually are and should be the most powerful voices at any kind of international conversation, and certainly even at the local community conversation levels. So if you haven't ever personally identified as a member of civil society, I offer you that, because it is an extremely powerful role that we play as the human species on this planet. And so the civil society voices brought the US fair share and the messaging of fair shares to COP26 as one of our highest priorities to convey to the world's governments that we are holding our governments and our corporations and our private sectors accountable for doing our fair shares. Our fair share emissions reduction goals is based on responsibility and capacity, said that, provides international climate finance. It's all about who's going to pay for this, and we need to pony up. We need to pay for mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. Fair Share centers environmental justice, human rights, and gender equality, which were huge issues in Glasgow and have been through all of the 26 COPs. And yet the governments have refused to prioritize those very words. And in fact, the language of human rights is not included in some of the most important articles of the Paris Agreement. And then finally, Fair Shares commits to climate action to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. It's been shown time and time again, and the fact that the US Climate Action Network, made up of all of those organizations, both huge multi-million-dollar organizations that we call the Big Greens, all the way down to local groups like yours, agreed that this is what needs to happen if we're really going to limit global warming to 1.5. So I'm looking at my clock right now, and I think I have time to share this video with you. It's very important that we hear from the very voices that we are working to lift up. So I can tell you about loss and damage, but I think it'll work a lot better. And just please let me know if you cannot hear this video. I'm really hoping that you're going to be able to.
The present is already catastrophic. The present is already scary. If we fail to address loss and damage, the future will be much worse. This is loss and damage. It's what happens when climate change intensified disasters like hurricanes, wildfires, and floods, and slow-moving catastrophes like droughts and sea level rise lead to a loss of life, culture, biodiversity, territory, and livelihoods, as well as damage to homes, hospitals, schools, and roads, which often forces people to flee their homes.
Loss and damage as of this year, 2021, is taking place in every single country in the world, including the rich countries. but the biggest impacts are on poorest people living in the poorest countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
If your island is going underwater, you have to leave. If your farmland is turning into desert, you have to move. And if forest fires are destroying your home, what choice do you have?
Last year, around mid-May, we saw heavy rainfall causing 4 rivers to burst their banks in the western part of the country, causing massive destruction and leaving over 100,000 people displaced.
In the global negotiations on climate change, in the Paris Agreement agreed in 2015, there's an article, Article 8, that says we need to deal with loss and damage. But unfortunately, there hasn't been a single penny paid for loss and damage yet.
And this is a problem because areas prone to loss and damage are no longer insurable.
Insurance is something that works on probability. When you know that you are definitely going to face climate impacts, insurance doesn't work.
Therefore, money for people to put their lives back together needs to come from somewhere else.
Those who are at the front lines are the least responsible for the climate crisis. I do believe in the polluter pays principle. Fossil fuel companies and the biggest polluting countries, they have the responsibility to provide compensation for loss and damage.
The major fossil fuel companies around the world have known for decades that they were producing a polluting product, and they have suppressed that information and they prevented action. As a result, they've made billions of dollars of profit. Therefore, they are completely liable to be challenged now to pay up for the loss and damage that they have knowingly caused and they have profited from.
Although there is clearly a pressing need to support communities impacted by loss and damage, finance has been blocked, denied, and deemed too expensive by those who have polluted.
The global north hasn't done anything about loss and damage because it has refused to accept responsibility for the climate crisis. They don't want to pay the bill.
With similar compensation funds already in existence, it is high time to set one up for loss and damage.
We do have an example of compensation for pollution. The major oil companies quite willingly put money into a pot, and if there's an oil spill anywhere, the people who are affected don't have to prove which company caused it. That's the kind of thing that we need for loss and damage from climate change.
The present is already catastrophic. The present is already scary. And if compensation is not given, the future is going to be much worse.
With COP26 rapidly approaching, it's time to put loss and damage firmly on the agenda.
COP26 coming up later this year is a critical event where the issue of loss and damage has to be front and center. Otherwise, the developing countries, particularly the most vulnerable countries, will deem the COP a failure.
The COP will be successful only if a compensation fund is put in place for communities that are facing the impacts of the climate crisis right now.
We have been waiting and waiting for the last 30 years, and we cannot wait any longer.
If we do not address loss and damage, then there is no climate justice.
It's not just what loss and damage is, but what it means. It speaks of the existential threat that the heating of our fragile band of atmosphere represents. It's the signpost of what's to come, the alarm bell that tells us we are running out of road for ignoring it as if it isn't there. We are running out of road for doing nothing proportionate to the scale of the problem. We are running out of road. Taking care of those at the sharp end of this climate change that is happening now, not tomorrow, but now, is urgent and long overdue.
Okay, so that makes me cry every time I watch it. It's very difficult to talk about And yet it has to be at the absolute priority of how we address the climate emergency and what we truly talk about. So I am going to move on to what happened at COP26, because you can see that video was put together by Loss and Damage Collaborative International. As I've mentioned over and over again, the U.S. Climate Action Network and members of civil society are very involved in that conversation. And we were the ones that brought that and lifted this up at COP26. So I am going to come back to this and stop my screen sharing there for a moment, so that I can go over what has happened and what it meant for all of this heaviness and the delay that took place for this COP to even happen, and what kind of expectations moving into the COP were sort of established prior to it even beginning. And I think what really stood out for me, and I know we're going to get into question and answers here pretty quickly, but I want to run through really quickly what happened while we were over there. I'm going to send you a lot of links. Some of the things that I wanted to be sure that you were aware of is that we did ask for the COP to be postponed. There were countries all over the world that asked the UK to recognize that we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and one of the worst things you could possibly do is bring 50,000 plus people together and have them travel, and the inequities of the pandemic and the vaccination. The U.S. Climate Action Network sent a letter to the State Department asking the United States government to ask for the COP to be postponed, not because we didn't want there to be global conversations around the climate emergency, but out of justice and respect for countries that have not received any of the vaccine yet. We wanted to honor that, and that request was denied. So the COP did go forward, and actually the largest delegation you might have seen in the news of any group, and I mentioned government and private sector and civil society, the largest delegation was representations from the fossil fuel industry. Somehow, not surprisingly, they were all able to make it to Glasgow and have their wine and dining and lots of events, with delegations from governments and corporations. And many of the representations from civil society were left out in the streets in lines. It took hours and hours and hours to get into the building. And so right away, the COP was considered to be a complete chaos scenario. And for the folks that I was communicating with on a daily basis, they did a debriefing for those of us that were communicating here domestically across the United States. We prayed for them and gave thanks to them, because it was truly, I think, a privilege to be able to stay home from this event. And that's very, very sad. And quite frankly, I probably got to watch more of the events online, because everything was live streamed, than many of the people that traveled over there and spent a lot of money to be there. But I'm grateful that we showed up in person to make these demands around justice and equity on a global scale. And so so we were able to meet with the State Department, the United States State Department. So President Biden went over, and the global heads, you probably saw, were there. This is a 2-week-long event. And so at the very beginning of the event, they front loaded the world leaders who got to all kind of state their piece. And Biden came across as very tired and a little overwhelmed, and just kind of reflected back on the fact that our nationally determined contribution, an NDC, which is what all of these committee parties show up at an international negotiation with. When we signed the Paris Agreement, we said we would each as our own nations, make our own commitments. And the commitment that the United States has made to reducing global carbon emissions is right at about 50%. So that 195% that I showed you that we are accountable for, that is our fair share to address, and 70% of that being domestic emission reductions, this United States government has committed only to reducing 50% emission reductions and not invest at all on an international scale to help developing countries. So that was very disappointing, but that is what we showed up at the COP with, and that is what President Biden spoke to. I will give some credit. It is the largest commitment of any government that has ever held office, any administration in the United States. So it is a significant pledge, but it's not what it needs to be. And I think that's sort of the takeaway of everything that's happening right now, is that the United States government is patting itself on the back for doing the most that any administration has ever done. And yet we know it's still not enough. So we celebrate wins, we celebrate successes, things like the Build Back Better Act getting passed, the infrastructure plan getting passed, although there's no climate allocation in that. We know it is not what we need to really address the problem. And that's why I come back to that loss and damage video and what is really being asked of us and required of us to show up with. And I think people like ourselves, those of you in this room with Carolina Nature Coalition, the others that I work with around this country and around the globe, are ready to awaken to the recognition that our governments are not going to do this for us. There's too much politics. It's too much embedded in dirty money. The fossil fuel industry has too much of a strangle on the way in which our governments are set up, that it's time for the civil society representation to take the lead. We are now driving the cart, and so I'm very excited about that. And I would say ultimately, and I want to go to questions because I know we're going to run out of time, but ultimately, the pledges that were made at the COP26 get us to a place where we are closer to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius than we were before the COP started. So that is something to celebrate. And when we went into the Paris Agreement, we went to the Paris COP, our emission projections were actually twice the amount that they are now today on the planet. So we are moving in the right direction, and we just have to make sure that we move faster and fiercer and with more intention than we have. And that's why I am so excited about all the work that's taking place moving forward, because we can totally do this. We just have to sort of skirt around the lack of political will and find that we hold the power and that we can come together in international solidarity and solve at least what is the extreme version of catastrophe, and out of respect address what has already happened and will continue to happen. And I know I don't have to say this to you and your communities because of everything that you've experienced here locally in North Carolina with flooding and hurricanes and storm impacts and injustices on a daily basis. So loss and damage should really resonate at the local level, and it's something that we can carry with us moving forward. Lastly, I would just say, because I've had the opportunity to meet with members of the State Department and speak to, we've had the ear of John Kerry, Special Envoy on Climate, to the President. The response that we've gotten back from this administration as to why they are not champions of loss and damage finance and why their ambition is cut short because they're not meeting the U.S. climate fair share, their answer was very earnest and authentic, and I honor them for that because I do think it's always important to tell the truth. And they said that they have failed, that developed countries and rich countries have failed poor nations and nations that are suffering first and worst time and time again, and that they do not want to make commitments that they don't believe that they can hold onto. And basically this administration told all of us that they don't believe Congress will allocate the financial resources necessary to do what we need to do. And so they don't want to pretend, and they don't want to greenwash, and they don't want to make false promises. And so they just didn't do it. And so that's where we're at. So I can't see any of you. I know that was a lot. I hope that you feel informed and also inspired to be mobilized, and that we can have this just be the beginning of a conversation. And I have tons of resources that I will share in an email that you can read about and learn about. And I would drop them into the chat. I've done a lot of these presentations, but I know there's not that many people online. So if we can make sure that everybody that participated today can be a part of this conversation moving forward. I am very, very excited to build bridges across what the U.S. Climate Fair Share is, how we support loss and damage, and help to continue to mitigate our existing emissions while preparing communities for adaptation and resiliency. So with that, I will hand it back to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Susannah. You answered a lot of my questions, especially about one of my questions was that the young people and the nations in the global South were demonstrating at COP26. They were out there trying to, and indigenous people were out there demonstrating, and because they said that this was one of the least representative COPs, that they've had. So
I think one of the main questions to that point is that there, and especially from indigenous leadership of who we must first and foremost follow and listen to, as well as young people, is, and you probably saw this throughout the news, is that they believe that the process is broken, that trying to get together with governmental organizations to come up with, a solution through the COP process doesn't work. And I am just naturally a person where I kind of always go along with both. And this is definitely broken, and it's the only thing that we have. And it's interesting because it is the only way that the countries will come together. And they do have a role to play. And one of the things that I've asked the Fair Shares now developing international network and the Indigenous Environmental Network, IEN, of who you probably follow and see a lot of their information that they send out, are asking similar questions of, if the governments won't do their fair shares, who's going to pick up the slack? And is there a way in which the private sector and civil society can supersede what the governments aren't doing? And something that I just want to share, because I know, and you're in a Unitarian Universalist church there, and I'm a Unitarian Universalist, there has been over $57 trillion pledged in the form of religious financial divestment. And that is an enormous amount of money. And so when you think on a global scale of all of the religious denominations that have pledged to divest from fossil fuels, we need to move that conversation into the discussion of reinvestment. All of that money should be earmarked as climate finance. And so particularly if communities of faith and conscience recognize what was being shared in that loss and damage video, we have got to care for people immediately. And this isn't just about property loss and damage. This is about cultural loss and damage. This is about loss of human life. This is about loss of biodiversity. There is so much that needs to be accounted for. And we shouldn't just sit around and wait for our governments to figure this out. We can allocate these resources. So that's what inspires me, is like, I'm over it. I'm over trying to figure out how to get, I mean, I still want to do advocacy. I still want to call my members of Congress. I still want to be involved in, people that are elected into places of power, but we've got to remember our power.
Are there any questions from the audience? Okay.
So yeah, so telling stories, storytelling is the next part of this. We did have a little bit of funding this past summer in partnership with our sister organization in Georgia and a national organization called Creation Justice Ministries. And we are looking to document stories, real-time stories of yours. So if you, have experienced loss and damage in your life and want to document that, we would love to film you. We'd love to share your story. We'd love for you to share your story. Obviously, we have to be communicating at the levels that each one of us will really connect to. And so your neighbors and your friends and your family that you are closest to be able to have this conversation, I think is far more approachable than talking about, carbon parts per million in the atmosphere. And I know that money is probably my least favorite thing to think about. And yet this aha moment and experience that I've had around thinking about all of our economies, both locally and nationally and globally, in the form of climate finance, really helps ground me in the work that we can be doing. And back to divestment, one thing that I always say, and we have the blessing of having some of the best credit unions in the country here in North Carolina. Where we bank matters, where we spend our dollars matter. I mean, there's not a thing that we do that isn't somehow connected to the global climate emergency. And so being conscientious about that, especially as we move into the season of giving and gratitude, I think is a really a beautiful way of moving forward with the resources that we do have and the resources that we're asking to be allocated to really shift course and do what we need to do.
Okay.
Susannah,
We have a question here, right at the UU here.
Oh, great.
can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello.
Well, this isn't a question. It's more of a comment. I've done a lot of international work, and it's not a one-sided issue. I mean, you talk about compensation, but these countries that are impacted have responsibilities as well.
Yes.
They have the responsibility of moving people out of marginal lands. They have the responsibility of having people not be cutting down the mangrove swamps and being moved out of those marginal lands. In this country with the fires in California, a lot of the problem was people were living in the forests and they didn't take proper precautions. And then you get to the other level of money reaching a country. In our history of development in these developing countries, so much of the money that goes never reaches the ground to do anything.
That's right.
So the big problem is on two sides. One's the responsibility of the giving countries, the other is responsibility of the receiving countries, and how to make that work is the challenge. It's not just moving money, it's the challenge of making it effective, but also the challenge of population control. We don't even hear about that anymore. We talk about people and people in trouble, but we don't talk about one of the reasons they're in trouble is because of the areas they've moved into because of not having productive lands where they should be living on and moving into lands where they shouldn't be. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate your comments. I think, again, I'm looking forward to having this. This obviously is not a one-off, and I'd love to learn more about your international experience as well. I think specifically with regards to actually moving people from where they find themselves is a very, very important conversation to be having, and why people are where they are. also out of due respect that, that the first thing to address is the fact that they are where they are, and not try to go back and do any kind of analysis of how they got there, because the reality is that if you live on an island that's going to be underwater, this idea that they should have, it occurred to them to get off that island is not ours, not our story to tell, but instead to understand that if their island, the reason that their island is going underwater is because of sea level rise, which they did not cause, then that's sort of the circular nature of accountability and fair shares that we were talking about. And you're right, it's not just about cutting a check. I mean, you can't just hand a check. There's got to be entire systemic transformation in the way that we address what we consider to be an emergency and a crisis on this planet. One of the things, and I'll definitely share this with you, I know we're at time now, but the Institute for Policy Studies, been working very closely with them based out of Washington, D.C., and they have done a very, very clear analysis of the amount of money that that this country and then other developed countries invest in their military budgets. And I know, again, totally another conversation for another time, but if we took those allocated resources and shifted the focus of what we are doing on an international scale, we actually have deployed experts all over the world and deployed resources that could immediately help those in need if we were thinking about why we're there from a different perspective. So it's not even about having to come up with new money. It's about thinking differently about who and what we're doing and what the real problem is in the world. And so I find hope in that as well. I just hope those that are in control of making those decisions, that again is a role of the United States government. But thank you for that comment. Yes, this is all so complicated, and I, rather than sitting at home, and that's why I wanted to make sure that people knew what COP was and how to engage. It's not just a handful of people over having a conversation about the future of everything. It's about having these conversations around our dinner tables and around our breakfast nooks, and keeping the conversation going. So thank you for that.
Any other questions in the audience here? In the back there.
As part of the blurb on the internet, I read something about the island of Vanuatu and how it's being flooded. Well, I did a little research, and a mere 6,000 years ago, the ocean was 30 foot shallower. So in 6,000 years, they've lost a lot of island. All right. So as the island was going underwater, I imagine some of those people got in boats and went to other islands. And maybe some of those people came to Canada over the Bering Strait or whatever and populated other places. So we have this environmental awareness. And I think the 900-pound gorilla that nobody wants to touch is overpopulation. If we weren't overpopulated, we wouldn't be living in readily flooded areas. We wouldn't be living in river valleys. We wouldn't be living in forests where our houses would burn. So, as the other gentleman said, is anything proposed at COP to do anything about population control of the #1 predator species on the planet Earth? Because if you don't do anything about population control, except help everybody dies and goes to heaven, or if you're a Hindu, you'll get born and come back as a cockroach. And if you're India, you'll come back as a cow, as a way to solve Earth's population problem. So to me, it seems the biggest problem is we have 3 major religions that say you can have all the sex you want, make all the babies you want, and it ain't my problem. Thank you.
Wow, yeah, very strong perspectives, and I certainly appreciate the dialogue. I wish we had more time, and if I was there, it would feel so I could see you. It would feel better. But as this is an ongoing debate, and actually, it's interesting. I think the previous gentleman said that you don't hear as much about population control or the population crisis as it was laid out. Predominantly in the 80s and the 90s. And part of that, I think, is that there has been a lot of research, and I will absolutely share this in the packet that I will send to distribute, that it's actually not the number of people on the planet that are the problem, it's the way in which we are consuming the resources. And so in the theory of abundance, there is more than enough for everyone to be able to live harmoniously and actually very, very well on this planet. However, back to the theme of fair shares, there are a small number of individuals, communities, and countries that are consuming far more than their fair share in relationship to what is equitable. And so back to the notion around equitability, and there is so much conversation, and the United States is, internally, I think, looking at a community level around justice and equity and inclusion and decision making and the distribution of resources that is so important at this time. Because you'll appreciate this because you mentioned the world's religions. I went to seminary in 1998, not because I wanted to talk about climate change for the rest of my life, but because I wanted to talk about essentially an ecological ethic. And when I refer to that, I mean humans in that, and the language of creation care or caring for God's creation. We are of this creation. We are one with all of this. And our ethical responsibility to the interdependent web of existence is completely lost in the ways in which we have designed and constructed. And when I say we, I mean the collective we, because we participate in it as long as we are not dissident to it. And so where we find ourselves in 2021 is in a place of great consumption, and we know it. And we're trying to get out of it. And as they would say, and the fossil fuel industry really has a hold on all of us, a strangle on all of us, because it's really, 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 really hard to get out of this system and this cycle. And so this is really a spiritual crisis. It's that's what I was interested in, is what is really going on here. And I just, find our truth. I love the questions today. I love the discussion because it's really about speaking the truth and seeking the truth, and then holding ourselves accountable for what that truth is. And all I know is that the people that I've met that are living in communities where their entire family is going to need to figure out not only how to get into a physically different place on Earth in order to survive, but how they're going to be able to do that is something that I care deeply and desperately about. So advocating with compassion is something that we lead with, and it's these kinds of discussions that get us to what the real truth is for our communities. So thank you for that.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us here at a distance.
Well, thank you for having me. I know let's make it happen in person sooner than later. Thank you for all the work that the Carolina Nature Coalition does. I went to your Twitter account today, and I appreciate that. I hope any ways we can be communicating via social media is awesome. And y'all really are on the front lines in your communities, on the waters. And I know you work very, very hard day in and day out to protect the people and places that you love. So I'm here for you. I aim to serve you, and I'm grateful for this opportunity.
Which brings me back to the Carolina Coalition lives on donations. We don't get funding from anybody, but the people who attend our presentations. And if you like what we're doing, please donate. There's a donation box around the corner. And we want to keep this going. And thanks again to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship and to Stevie, who has run it through the technical difficulties, and we finally got it done.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'm going to pledge right now a $100 donation from North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light to Carolina Nature Coalition. So,
Okay.
the fact that you're having this conversation is what we.
Well, thank you. We could use it.
I will do that. I'll send
Okay.
it. Thank you.
And I look forward to you sending the material, and we'll get it out to people.